thanks for coming. My name's Nicole DiHoratius. I teach in the DRO group here. So I teach operations, sustainable operations, supply chain. And I'm just going to quickly introduce our guests and then hand it over to our fantastic moderator, who has way more expertise in the energy space than I will ever have. And so let me just first thank the Tamer Institute for hosting these events all week. So it's fantastic that they're willing to do this and fund and underwrite some of the events that are happening all this week. And second, I want to actually thank Emma and Timothy Hashman at the Columbia Tech Ventures for helping us sort of get to know the startup community in this area. So very grateful for that along the way. All right, so those of you know that this is called Innovation and Climate, and we're talking about from policy to practice. So we picked practitioners here that have all been helped or hindered by different policy events over the course of the last few years. So we're going to be hearing a little bit about that along the way, and I'm hoping that you will ask some questions. So we'll start here. We've got Josh Hashman, your Director of Product Development for Amogy, and Amogy is a company that is converting ammonia to power generation for maritime products and data centers and things along those lines, helping with the grid. And here we have Jeffrey Prosserman, CEO and founder of Voltpost. And Voltpost is about democratizing our access to energy by converting lampposts to platforms to charge electric vehicles along the way. And we have our very own Annie Lee, so a Columbia grad along the way. And she is Director of Business Development at Arbon, which is a carbon sequestering company. So we're getting a whole wide range of things. And last but not least, we've got Bernardo Matalucci, and he is also a co-founder and CEO of Mimic Systems. And this is a new way of generating heat and cooling systems using solid state technology. He was also the recipient of a Europe 40 Under 40 Design Award. And it was a finalist for the Fast Company World Changing Ideas Award. And I'll turn it over to Mark, but just let me say Mark is new here. So if you have the chance to take a class with him, I would recommend doing so. He's been a fabulous addition, and he has a ton of expertise both in the field in energy, but also as a teacher and instructor in this space. So I'll hand it over to you to moderate.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. Great to be here with you all. Thank you for having me, and we're fortunate to have a really esteemed panel here. And before I start to jump into a lot of the policy stuff, which I think is important, I think it would be good for the room if we could, for you all, the panelists, to kind of help us understand the problem that each of you are solving with your startup, and I guess maybe why it hasn't been solved before. Bernardo, I'll start with you. Cause where's your head at with that? Like, how has, what space are you in and what problems are you solving?
All right. Can you hear me, guys? Mike, good?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure being here. I'm a former architect, and this is one of those buildings where when you walk in, it's so amazing with the stairs and the connectivity. So I just have to say that this is an amazing setting. And I think that when we think about the problem that we're trying to solve is that how can we leverage technology to actually make a contribution when it comes to heating and cooling. When we think about heating and cooling, a fridge, storing the produce, cooling a data room, a data server, providing heating or cooling to a building or a supermarket, I think realistically what we are talking about today is that a technology that was developed or actually discovered in 1902 by Will Carrier. He discovered that if you use certain fluids or certain chemicals, when they change state from gas to liquid, they are able to absorb or release heat. Those chemicals are called refrigerants. And he learned that instead of using for manufacturing, if you use it for people, it's way more lucrative. And so this is how we started, how air conditioning started. And this is how we see it every day. Now, the biggest problem that we see is that air conditioning uses this kind of chemicals, which are pretty nasty, not only from a climate perspective, but also from a health perspective. Some of the so-called refrigerants are, they can trigger serious health issues. They are very potent chemicals, and they can also, back in the days, they could affect the ozone depletion. So some of the ozone-depleted refrigerants have been banned. If you remember the Freon, now we cannot use it currently, but the reality is that we use different type of chemicals. And from a maintenance perspective, refrigerant leaks is a big problem, big maintenance problem. And so what we are developing at Mimic is a technology solution that instead of using a compressor or a refrigerant, we move heat with electrons through solid state matter. So we have whatsoever no moving part in the core technology. Everything is solid state, and can alleviate the problem of not using refrigerants, but also reduce maintenance costs. This is what you're trying to do. Sorry, a long answer.
No, that's great. And John, I want to bring you in on here too, because I know that in your role, right? I know that ammonia has been a fuel source that's been, I guess, technically understood for a while, right? And,
yeah.
But I guess what changed to kind of was the catalytic moment to kind of use ammonia as a kind of catalytic source, so to speak,
yeah.
to start for the startup, and rather than it's been understood for a while, like why now?
For sure. Yeah. So everyone, John Hashman. So Amogy, what we do is, as you mentioned, ammonia. We unlock ammonia's ability to be used as a hydrogen carrier for decarbonization. So the problem statement that you mentioned in the first question, what we're trying to solve is I would say the world's biggest problem right now, which is the climate crisis and decarbonization. And for a long time, people have looked at hydrogen to solve that. It's zero emissions. When you burn it, it generates water. But hydrogen is very difficult to transport and very difficult to store. It requires several hundred degrees negative Celsius to store as a liquid, hundreds of bar to store at that same liquid, and you lose it as you store it. It can pass through metals, it can evaporate that you need to burn off, so it's very uneconomic to store. What Amogy does is we allow people to use ammonia, which is NH3, as a way to transport and store that hydrogen. And so, as you mentioned, ammonia has been around for 100 years. The Haber-Bosch process was one of the very first chemical industrial processes that basically are the foundation for the chemical engineering degree that a lot of people get today. And what Amogy does that I think is unique is that ammonia has been around, and ammonia cracking has been around for a long time. It's something that's well understood. It's it's built into refineries all around the world. And what we do is we have a proprietary catalyst that is more active than anything that's on the market that allows you to take these huge refinery scale crackers and reduce that size down to the size of a refrigerator. So that unlocks power generation in a distributed fashion, whether it's for mobility, in trucking and shipping, or in distributed power generation on land for off-grid uses.
Awesome. And Annie, I'm going to bring you in on here too. Carbon capture, air capture. This isn't a new technology, also, right? So, I guess what are you doing differently that others couldn't seem to figure out, right? So I just want to hear your take. Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Annie, Director of Business Development at Arbon. So Arbon is actually a spun-off from Columbia University. So it's really particularly meaningful to be back here for this conversation. And so this is the research backed by 12 years of research, material research at Columbia. And we didn't set out to start a company. We were researchers, deeply believed in this technology that we thought could generally move the needle in carbon removal. And yeah, when the climate tech boom of the investment happened 3 years ago, that's when investors started looking for the technologies that just make sense economically, and that's when they found us. So what we do differentially is that we capture CO2 from air and from industrial points emissions just by using water. A lot of carbon capture technologies out there are using high heat or high pressure that's energy intensive. And we do this by a fundamental shift in chemistry mechanism. And the science was incredibly early, but the market wasn't ready. So it was done over a decade of research, but we were waiting until the market was there with a strong signal of the demand from industries, the policies, 45Q, and so on. So the key differentiator, I will say, is the eliminating completely the need of heat and pressure, that really allows us to unlock the cost effectiveness of this expensive carbon capture out there.
So the theme I'm getting from the panel thus far, and Jeff, I'm gonna pull you in here, is I guess access to these resources, right, and making using technology to make energy access more readily available to folks in a more efficient way. And I guess, Jeff, we all know that EV charging is a known infrastructure gap here in the United States, and I guess from your perspective, what is, how does Voltpost kind of help fill that gap and close that gap? I'm just kind of asking, and it's pretty obvious, but and why hasn't this, I guess, what have been the bottlenecks for you guys?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having us. Jeff Prosserman, co-founder and CEO at Voltpost, and we're on a mission to decarbonize mobility by democratizing charging access. And we do that by retrofitting existing street lights, utility poles into level 2 chargers to allow everyone to go from gas to electric. And recognizing that transportation is one of the largest sources of GHG emissions, if we want to smooth that transition, then having public charging access in communities is vital. And so a few years back, we've been doing this 5 years now. This actually came out of a research paper that I wrote in the Columbia University Sustainability Management graduate program, recognizing firsthand in the midst of the pandemic the lack of public charging, and that even people who cared about innovation or sustainability would not make the leap if there wasn't that proper access. So seeing signals of how in Europe people were starting, or companies were starting to do the same type of solution, retrofitting existing streetlights as well as providing curbside charging access, but nobody had really picked up the ball in the US or North American market. That really started a journey here, and we are a venture-backed company and now scaling our deployments across the US. And so really, as an impact-driven company, there's certainly a lot of interesting policy dimensions of the last 2 years, call it, and really the last 5 years from when we first started this, both tailwinds and headwinds, which I'm excited to share more on today.
Cool, awesome, thank you, Jeff. Now, the thing I kind of want to start with now that we kind of got kind of some ground foundational information out there, I think for the thing that's interesting to me is that all of you've built a company or startup at different points or in a specific policy environment, let's say, right? And we all know that landscape is ever changing at the federal level, state level, even at the local level, right? So I guess I'm going to lob this question out to the group, and you guys, anybody can take it, but how has that shaped the way that you've operated, or has it changed the way you've operated? What sorts of challenges have you faced within that? So I'll just lob that out to you guys. Anybody can jump on and take that. But
Sure, I can start.
Yeah.
I think one of the largest policy drivers behind Amogy's business, at least originally, and maybe I'll start this because it's an interesting open question, probably in everyone's business today, is changing policy. Originally, we had a lot of support for our business with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, mandate for decarbonization of shipping by 2050. So basically, all ships around the world run on basically bunker fuel, which is the most polluting form of oil and gas that kind of is out there. And by 2050, UN-backed International Maritime Organization had mandated that all shippers have to go to net zero emissions. And so shipping companies and countries around the world were looking to future fuels to help allow them to make that transition. And a lot of countries had identified ammonia as that future fuel that could help supply that. And so Amogy really went all in behind that. One of our demonstrations, our most recent one actually, was a 100% ammonia-powered tugboat that we built up in Kingston, New York. It's about 2 hours north of here, if anyone ever wants to come see it. Runs on ammonia. But, an interesting transition obviously has occurred over the past couple years. And the IMO, after some pressure from the United States, amongst other governments, has started to defer their mandate for net zero by 2050. So that's kind of had some interesting implications on Amogy's positioning and how we've kind of grown and evolved since our foundation as a maritime-focused company. But as that policy has evolved, we've evolved with it and have now kind of, rather than positioned ourselves as a company that you have to use because it's mandated, we've evolved our value proposition so that people will still choose Amogy, not just for maritime, but for land-based systems, regardless of the policy environment. And we've seen a lot of traction in that space where we've kind of differentiated ourselves from just the current policies that are out there.
Cool. Yeah. Any other takers? I mean,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I like to add a little bit on top of what John said. So Arbon was built from the policy. So it was a policy-enabled startup for sure. And now it's the time where the uncertainty came. But one thing that I want to highlight is that the 45Q that we were built on are still there. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed last year still preserved this 45Q. And among the clean energy sectors, and most of them were phased out, but carbon credit was one of the only ones that survived. But that really was a market signal. Also want to mention the recent noise about the corporate buyers adjusting their purchasing speed for the engineered solutions. My feeling is that they didn't have to bring the market to gigatons. They were supposed to be catalysts. So I think they've done their job and they have created a strong signal for this voluntary carbon market, but at the same time also tell startups like us to be prepared for the volatility of these policies. What we do is that we expanded the portfolio of use cases of our businesses that are independent of the carbon market. So for example, ESAF, cement curing, and beverage grade CO2, they're already there as a commodity market, independent from market with the industry buyers already with their own economic rationale. So 45Q was a tailwind, but now we're trying hard to build a business cases that are still viable even without those tax credits.
So just the narrative of the last 5 years is fascinating. There'll be books written about this one day. If you take a step back, I mean, we started the company in Q1 2021, and that's just as Biden came into power, and ultimately the Infrastructure Act and all of the money coming into decarbonization and 7.5 billion dedicated to public charging rollout across the country. Over the course of the first few years, obviously climate tech VC became a label that was in fashion, and ultimately we raised early stage financing to get through initial pilots through that wave, alongside a lot of other companies, including Amogy and others, which we're familiar with from the ecosystem in New York. And ultimately, that created a foundation for a lot of these companies to get to a certain point of technology validation, business validation through early pilots, discovery, etc. Many of which, like ourselves, managed to raise a second round of financing from the private sector before the policy dimension shifted, develop new customer relationships, expand presence, get to commercialization, and then ultimately the landscape in the last 2 years with the current administration has fundamentally flipped everything upside down. And with that, in the example of Voltpost in the EV charging industry, effectively we won 3 federal contracts tied to that 7.5 billion. There's 2 buckets, the NEVI fast charging money, which is $5 billion of funding, and then the CFI funding, which is 2.5 billion, which is where we won the 3 federal awards, which in January of last year, through an executive order, all of that money was frozen. And with that, the domino effects of the entire industry translated into climate tech VC pulling back. At this point, I would argue doesn't actually exist, just a lot of fund managers who are dancing around the space, although that may be controversial to a few, but frankly are just re-optimizing their portfolio to other aspects of infrastructure or energy policy. And for companies, Voltpost included, had to become more capital efficient, optimize to the current landscape, and then ultimately find a path forward through private sector partnerships, pulling up revenue, and frankly, operating on a slightly different business model from where we all started. Certainly can get into it more, but really fast forward to today, I think that some of that dust has settled. The funds that were frozen, not just in EV charging, but across the IRA. Ultimately, there's a number of lawsuits that are progressing for the charging sector. The first lawsuit on the NEVI front had 16 states, including New York, sue the federal government with Justice and the Sierra Club, and have effectively won that lawsuit. So at this point, the funds are starting to flow. The second lawsuit for CFI, the 2.5 billion, that is still progressing, following the same playbook with effectively the same parties engaged to complete that over the next few months, which, since the funds were illegally frozen last January, should entail a similar result. But it has dramatic impacts both in the private sector and institutional investors' confidence in the sector, confidence in federal policy and where to invest in this country or more internationally, and so on. So I'll just pause there because I can just probably give a whole 2-hour lecture just on this. Let others pick up the ball here.
Yeah, probably from our side, it's a little bit different than what you heard from my three colleagues. When you look at refrigerants, I think, guys, we're here in the business school, right? The first thing that you know is you want to try to find a customer that wants to adopt your technology instead of has to adopt your technology. So I think that's a real challenge that we had to face, especially at the onset, simply because probably, I don't know, maybe you saw the same, but in our case, there are no incentives, and there were no incentives to adopt refrigerants. So everybody knows that they are shitty. Everybody knows that they are harmful chemicals, but there aren't and there weren't incentives to say, if you use this refrigerant-free solution, would give you, I don't know, credit or something like that. There is still the mandate, the Kigali Agreement, which comes from the protocol ratification, the Montreal Protocol ratification, which has been signed, including by the US, to get rid of refrigerants, HFCs, by 2030, 2040. And that is in place. The reality is that there aren't incentives to do this. There are simply the mandate. So the challenge that we actually had to face is that people were judging us not because we are a refrigerant-free company, but we had to come up immediately on the onset from a completely different economic value proposition. And so that was a very hard lesson that we learned on day one. What we still know today is that there is a very strong interest and willingness to get rid of refrigerants, but nobody still knows how, because the alternatives are not so easy as it may seem. And so this is from a little bit from a policy perspective. Maybe it's a little bit different than what we experienced.
Yeah, I kind of want to, and broader, you bring up something that kind of brought me to my next point here. And, you all kind of work kind of in these areas where you've got cutting edge technology or really innovative technology, but the policy floor in some way has kind of like been pulled, the rug has kind of been snatched from underneath you, and you have to adapt, right? But in that ever-changing sort of landscape where you're building something out that's very new, very innovative, the landscape is changing, I guess, and all of you are at various different stages of your growth within your companies, but how did you get your first client, your first customer? What did it take to get there, right? Being that you're so new and things are changing policy-wise, you're in a capital-intensive market. How did you get your first customer? So I'll pose it to you.
Yeah, in our case, it was actually a completely serendipitous coincidence of cosmic alignment. I mean, We are a New York City company. We were approached by an entity, nonprofit entity in Vancouver, Canada, who happened to basically had a program to provide access to cooling to people living with spinal cord injury in the city of Vancouver. And if you remember 2021, 2022, there was the heat wave, the heat dome in the Northwest. Maybe the years are off, I don't remember. That few years ago, there was the heat dome in the Northwest with Seattle, Vancouver, all that area. And basically they realized that people didn't have access to cooling technologies or access to cooling in general. And also, particularly in the city of Vancouver, they discovered that a vast portion of the people who died after the heat wave were people with limited mobility, with limited access to limited mobility. The elevators weren't working, the rooms were extremely hot, and when you have a physical disability, you actually struggle to adapt to extreme weather events. Your body simply doesn't work like a normal, regular person. So that was for us a moment where we actually learned that our technology is not just about making the room more comfortable, but is actually delivering high precision heating or cooling, and they invited us, they selected, I think, they screened about 100 companies. They shortlisted 3 of them, and we won the pitch competition. Within the pitch competition, there were engineering firms and there were people from the city of Vancouver, which invited us then to talk to them. And they told us that the city of Vancouver uniquely writes their own standards. And within their own standards, they have a mandate to get rid of refrigerants. So we basically ended up winning a paid pilot program supported by the city of Vancouver and this nonprofit, which came up to be the first contract that we got.
John, I want to bring you in here too, because it looks like, again, you're kind of targeting customers on a smaller megawatt scale, right?
Yeah.
Where maybe they don't have access to the grid interconnection. But so how did you get your first client? How'd you get there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it's different by first customer. And maybe I'll contrast a first couple different customers and partners against each other. So I think that the most critical factor in finding that first customer is, basically finding someone whose long-term goals and long-term vision is aligned with yours and aligned with the problem that you can uniquely solve. So that's, how we found our first few customers is, making sure that we're not just a flash in the pan that they can go buy something and then move on from. Your first customer, if you want to be a successful business, is a foundation that you're going to build the rest of your business on. And so making sure that that customer is more of a partner that you're aligned with in the long term has a lot of strategic value. And then second is meeting that customer where they are. I'm a chemical engineer. We build a product that's very heavy on chemical engineering. A lot of people don't want to understand the nuances of chemical engineering to be able to deploy your product, right? They need to, they want power, they're off the grid, they want it to just work and work all the time. And so engineering a solution internally that meets that customer where they are, where they want something turnkey, reduces the friction towards that customer uptake. That's more of in the United States, but we also have a lot of customers in South Korea where they are looking longer term at a more capital purchase business model where they actually do have some willingness to understand that chemical engineering problem and building that asset. So we meet those customers where they are on a different level and kind of align our business in that geo-market to what they're looking for. And I think that's been something that's very important, is kind of aligning your business to where people want you to be.
Interesting. And again, everybody here says very different models, and so you're hearing different stories here that are really interesting to hear from. And I kind of want to call out, and I don't want to just single you both out, but Jeff and Annie, I'm looking at both of you kind of partnering with the private sector. Annie with Microsoft and Google, and then Jeff, you've been working with NYSERDA and the utilities. How did you manage to bring them on board to your vision and kind of get them to partner with you in the ways that you have? And I guess what were some of the challenges there?
So jumping in, starting in the early days, you go through a lot of customer discovery before you get to a first customer. And you're just trying to learn if the thing that you're trying to solve for is something that actually generates value in a meaningful way that is worth pursuing before you put the first dollars in. And those conversations are critically important in shaping and refining the business case and market opportunity to make sure that what you're thinking of building is worth progressing. And so for us, being based in New York City and having those early conversations with the Department of Transportation here, with NYSERDA or EDC and Con Ed and Mayor's Office and others, I mean, ultimately, simple idea of attaching a EV charger to where the power is already coming from with the existing infrastructure, the street pole in front of you. But then when you get into the regulatory framework of what it actually takes to make that happen, the complex maze that frankly becomes the moat. The technology part is actually fairly simple and straightforward. It's working through and building trust with the various stakeholders to take that from concept to commercialization. And so for us, we ultimately built capacity, built trust, gain feedback to sharpen the vision in the early days prior to building any prototype or getting an initial pilot off the ground. We ended up securing the DOT in partnership with New Lab and the EDC for our first pilot project, where we retrofitted 2 New York City streetlights to show that this is technically feasible and something that could support reaching New York City's charging goals, as well as NYSERDA's on the state level. Participated in early stage accelerators that helped build a community of supporters, gaining access to a network of advisors and investors. And shout out to Columbia Technology Ventures, among others, who were there from the early days to help sharpen that vision as we continue to grow. But the reality is, like, when you start working with public agencies and utilities, when you're dealing with very bureaucratic stakeholders that are trying to de-risk anything when it comes to innovation. So ultimately, most of them, first of all, don't have a person to talk to progress something like what we've developed, let alone the budget to turn this into something. Now, fast forward, we have curbside charging projects with mandates that have been built into city council approved policies, which frankly started with early conversations 4 or 5 years ago of, do you think that this is worth doing and would it have value for your city or your constituents? And so there's a long road from going from those early pilots and gaining trust from people thinking it's a great idea and something that should exist on your block to actually working through that regulatory maze to make it happen at scale. I can say, just to not want to take too much time here and give others a chance to speak, it's also not a straight line from a New York City DOT paid pilot to working with NYSERDA to win a contract to deploy across New York State, to deploying with EDC in Brooklyn more recently. It really is having to work through all of these different stakeholders and reconnect with them at different times in order to get these projects to happen when you're deploying. So you're kind of connecting the dots and building the network effects between a bunch of agencies, utilities, and in our case, the private sector as well, to bring something like this to life.
Oh,
Yeah, sure.
can you speak after you got the contract? How quickly this deployment for the lampposts? And I want to contrast that with the sales cycle for a product like you make and the maritime sales cycle, which might be so long relative to this. I just want to get a sense for the speed of deployment and how that might change. And I'm sorry.
No,
I'll get
So for our solution, because it was a new interconnection method, I mean, we basically pulled together the 3D renderings of what this product could look like for the streets of New York City or another city to paint that vision alongside the value prop in a 10-page deck, right? A traditional kind of pitch deck. And what we did conversation by conversation, and at this point, 5 years in, we've labeled these, we've numbered them with the date and what number of the presentation. I think we're in 115 to 120 of this presentation, but every single step along the way in updating this presentation, we're taking insights where if in the early days, the NYC DOT said, well, this is a great idea, we want to do this, except we can't do this because the street lights don't have a meter. If you're going to do this, you need to figure out how to meter. And then obviously before we've taken the product too deeply in what's been invested to develop the first generation, we say, okay, well, let's just put a meter on it then. And then that meets a requirement that you're informing us would be necessary. And so I'm using that as an example, really to paint a picture that it really is an iterative process where you start in one place and then progressively over time, you get to the point where enough people are saying, oh, this is great. And an element of that 6 degrees of separation, just pulling together enough capacity or trust among different agencies, where then it turned into simply for our first pilot in New York City, the NYC DOT wanted to do this, Con Ed wanted to do this, the mayor's office was interested, EDC was interested. We had all of those conversations lined up. We spoke with the CEO at New Lab at the time, and they basically created a pilot program for curbside charging in New York City based off of all of these agencies wanting to progress this, but nobody actually having a programmatic way to make this happen. So they effectively created this off the back of all of these agencies trying to figure out how to work with us as a first proof of concept. And from there, effectively, it wasn't a huge budget commitment, but it was able to pay for that first generation prototype, which we deployed and showed that we could charge vehicles. And that obviously helped secure early stage financing. And by participating in those early stage accelerators as well, we kind of built that community and capacity around us that enabled us to get from 0 to 1. And then effectively each stage, you're kind of continuing to build those feedback loops and network effects and strengthen that trust, where now we're just doing that on a national level.
Did you want to?
Yeah, as far as sales cycle, I guess was the question you asked. It's interesting at Amogy because we have multiple product lines, ones that support maritime and ones that support stationary power. The maritime sales cycle was very shocking to me coming into this industry. I'm not a maritime person by background, but we have potential customers and customers that we're speaking to that are building ships that will be ready in the 2030s. And so they have that's a pretty long sales cycle to be able to work with. Whereas in the United States, power generation, they'll take it if you'll give it to them tomorrow. And it's interesting juggling those two factors between each other when you have a manufacturing lead time that is somewhere in between those two sales cycles. You don't want to have idle assets sitting for years, but tomorrow is maybe not shippable for you. And so that's kind of it's interesting juggling those two. And I would say that our biggest issue was building that regulatory roadmap and building that confidence for the first one. And so our first deployment in South Korea coming up later this year was about maybe 16 months of engagement planning before the first deployment. But a lot of that was driven by the regulatory environment. When you want to use ammonia to generate power, sometimes countries will be like, you want to do what with what? And you need to kind of explain to them why what you're doing is safe and can be certified. And so that was our big learning from our South Korean deployment, was to engage with the regulator early and often, so they understand that you're trying to do something right and build that partnership along the way.
Did you want to? I think she had asked you brought her way in, but yeah.
In our case, we won the competition we won the contract in February, and they wanted the day after. Basically, that's that was happened. We agreed to take 1 year to engineer it. We won the competition with a prototype. There is a difference between a prototype and something that has to go in the hands of somebody else that is not you. You can be electrocuted. Somebody else cannot be electrocuted. So there is liability, there is safety that has to be. There is leakage. There is compliance that has to be really, really understood. And in our case, the technology has a lot of very, very deep tech issues. Very deep tech things that we have to consider. We've been doing work in the clean room at Columbia University. So you have to make the semiconductors, there is a quality assurance, you have to put together a system around it. And this entire package has to be able to be certified by somebody who has whatsoever no idea what you're doing. So we engaged with safety compliance experts. And by November, more or less, we were able to get an idea of what to do. They disappeared. From November to March, they disappeared. They were not responding to emails, not responding to calls. They basically went incognito. We shipped the unit in December. We had the unit in a warehouse for a month and a half. We were able to find another certifier. We did everything then in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We flew there. We certified the units. We actually have we have certified units that have been deployed in the field with proper stickers, and we did that happening relatively quickly. But the challenge is that with sales cycles, and this is a process now that we can repeat in Canada. So we can probably we can do easily the same in the US, but now that we know that this can be repeated more quickly, the reality is that whenever we talk to customers, I think you mentioned something before, we really want to make sure that we engage with the right customer that understands that we don't have inventory. We don't have units in the stock sitting on a shelf. We need to make things for them. And that takes time and some patience from everybody.
Annie, I want to make sure I bring you in on here because you've got, I think all of you have your unique experiences with respect to before your startup journey, where you were before. And I think, Annie, one thing I've noticed about your background, you come from a PhD, you've got deep technical expertise, right? And in our conversations, you'd mentioned that that technical expertise really helped you. But moving to the startup space where you're talking with, you're building relationships with Google and Microsoft, et cetera, what was, I guess, that, through that transition, I guess, was there a skill set that jumped out at you, you realized that you didn't have and that you needed that was like non-technical or outside of your wheelhouse?
Definitely. That was a big startup moment that I had. When I started this startup, I didn't know that this would come this quite early, where we are aligning with multiple stakeholders. All of a sudden, I was sitting across finance, corporate, regulatory, and even procurement and engineering all at the same time. It's because we have a tier 1 customers based in Europe, heavy industrial emissions. And they found us because we have this great execution speed and the strength of our technology. And we started this deployment as a customer. We see them more as a collaborators because we didn't come with the finished product. It's more like sharing the risk with them, mitigating their risk specifically. And all of a sudden, we were already negotiating the partnership structures, how to build the design and the scopes of the projects and deployments, what the timeline would be. And having this technical background really helped communicate with all the stakeholders, because on one side, they have this industrial engineers talking about the technical validation, and the other side is investors and business people talking about the financing and regulatory realities. And this happened all before we had a large team or a playbook. So there was, so what I didn't anticipate, I knew this was coming, but I didn't anticipate this coming this fast. But I'm glad that we are doing and moving forward with this great partnerships we have. And based on partnerships, we're building several customer segments, even from cement and steel sectors. So we're very happy about it. And I'm glad I was able to bring this chemical engineering background with deep expertise to really facilitate this communication with them.
And Jeff, you've got similar experiences to some degree, right? Coming from Samsung and now coming over to Voltpost and starting Voltpost. What was that gap kind of coming from a large organization to a startup now, starting your startup? What was that gap and what did you realize that you were missing?
So prior to starting Voltpost, I was leading new product development at Samsung here in New York City and taking a portfolio of digital products from concept to market, both flagship phones and fridges with screens on them and cameras inside, and voice-enabled products back at the beginning of the smart speaker era. And honestly, just wanted to make something that made more of a positive impact and focus on climate tech, which what led me to the Columbia Master's Program in the midst of the pandemic. And starting Voltpost really didn't have a policy background whatsoever. I'm coming from developing technology at big corporate, but had worked in earlier stage tech over 20 years in tech in New York City. So knew how to do the software hardware thing or integrated consumer experience, but had no experience in working with public agencies and how to sell into that. And so that was certainly a learning curve in taking those meetings in the first few years. I think at this point, we've managed to build that trust across so many agencies that really becomes the moat. It's, again, coming back to not just the pure technology, because in the end of the day, it is an innovative deployment method, and we have proprietary technology and patents and things as part of the network that we're building. But the reality is that once you jump through the complex contracting process and build that trust and get in with some of these agencies, it's really sticky when you're thinking about that lock-in, because ultimately it's super hard just to figure out how to make that happen. And once you're on the other side of that, really becomes like a land and expand opportunity where you get an initial project going with certain partners. And then obviously in the case of where we are, in spite of the macro policy headwinds of the current administration, really is a speed bump in the road to electrification and net zero. So with that, in deploying from earliest pilots to initial broader scale commercial deployment to large scale, I mean, it really is just a stepping stone. And what you have to recognize as you're building this out is it's not a straight line in any one region, because the sales cycle is quite long and it's building that capacity. It could be starting with the project in New York City in our case, then jumping to Detroit and then to the outskirts of Chicago before getting larger scale projects across all three of those markets, before then expanding to other states and building more trust. And then it's just a whole web. And I'm just trying to crystallize this, but really more so to have everyone understand that when you're truly building public-private partnerships, you are trying to develop technology for the greater good, or at least that's the intention. Most people getting into this, because there's a lot easier ways to develop tech that just makes money for the sake of money. But once you really work through that and you do have the partners on the public side on board and that they are championing your technology, then it really becomes a different dimension where now you're just more in that relationship mode of trying to figure out how to expand into other partner agencies to make this really suit the need of the public.
Awesome. Before we jump into the audience, I do want to give you all a chance to ask the panel questions. I do have one last question. It's aside from the climate tech space, all you work in, all of your companies have some sort of connection to the power grid, either direct or indirect, but there's a relationship between your work and the electric power grid. And I guess my question to the group, as we kind of transition to the audience is, do you view that as an opportunity to connect yourself to the grid or to kind of expand your strategy? Is it a constraint? Where does that lie in your head, I guess, kind of how you are related to the grid. I'm just lob that out to the group.
Yeah, I can start
Yeah, sure.
because I spend a lot of my time, at least at the time, the strategic part of my time, talking about the grid. The grid is definitely a double-edged sword for power generation. It is the ultimate competitive marketplace. The grid has been around since, Thomas Edison, hundreds of years, and there are thousands of incredibly well-capitalized companies working their hardest to make the levelized cost of electricity for the consumer as low as possible. And so if you're going to compete with the grid, your costs had better be incredibly low. So that is the one edge of the sword, is it's incredibly competitive, but also the benefit is, and this is something that's very relevant for any new company, is that it's transparent in terms of pricing, right? You understand what the price people are paying for power. It's a commodity. And so you understand where you need to be. That sort of price discovery part of product market fit is very challenging for starting a new business. But if you're benchmarking power in a commodity business, you kind of already have a strong signal for what customers are willing to pay. So it does have some benefits as well.
So, anybody else want to weigh in? Or?
I mean, in our case, it's a little bit different because the grid basically wants us to disappear. If you think about a heat wave or a cold day, it's where the grid is particularly stressed out. Think about all the air conditioners, all the fridges that are in the supermarkets. Everything gets basically turned on at the same time. And magically, what they would like, what we hear that they would like to happen, is that basically we reach the plateau of infinite efficiency, which is not going to happen. It will never happen. It's just the laws of physics. The more we cool, the more we need cooling. Just the second principle of thermodynamics. We can't change that. The reality is that the only way we can engage proactively with the grid is trying to understand if there are different ways that we can manage heating or cooling at scale. For example, BC Hydro, British Columbia Hydroelectric, the grid, they offer a program where they can provide incentives for adopting air conditioning systems that can be managed remotely in the case of a heat wave. What happens is that then the grid becomes more resilient. The idea is that you don't need to cool a room or a supermarket to freezing levels, but if you keep it a little bit higher, then the grid is healthier and more resilient. This is how they see probably technology like us to participate into the load sharing of energy.
I could jump in. I mean, so we have two of the largest energy companies in the world as investors in our company. Exelon, the largest utility in the US that supports project development across their territories. We have projects in Chicago and Baltimore and DC. So we work directly with the utilities as customers. We also have RWE, one of the largest European energy companies, their energy transition investment team here in New York City, which is basically looking at Voltpost as their EV charging play in America, supporting our growth. And so we're directly tied into conversations with the utilities across the country every single day. And the grid is not just some thing out there, some future state, some metaphor. It really is the people who are powering the industry. I mean, ultimately, we're putting plugs on poles and really creating a new interconnection process. And what's exciting and fascinating in the work that we're doing is that we could be talking to Con Ed in New York City, and then 2 hours later, PG&E in California, or any utility in between. And ultimately, even though from a technology perspective, it's not that complex in putting level 2 chargers on poles, in the fact that we are defining or reshaping the regulatory landscape of how this actually happens, utility by utility, state by state, there are insights that we may be gaining from a project in Connecticut that then impact how we progress something on the streets of California. And ultimately, there's not really many other companies or any other companies that are figuring that portion out right now for public EV charging. I mean, there's a few, but in our spot, we really see what we're creating as the future of the grid and building something that could be more resilient. And as we think 5 to 10 years ahead, rather than the next 2 to 3, obviously with the EVs and the batteries, it creates an opportunity with the power to go bidirectionally. Right now, there's standards that need to be set, and we're certainly not at that point of where the technology is to be at mass scale, although there are certain vehicles that enable that. But certainly over the next 5 to 10 years, that power curbside and parking lots in densely populated neighborhoods through the vehicles themselves create an exciting opportunity of creating an energy marketplace to create a more resilient grid.
Yeah, I'll go last. So for carbon capture, energy is a very interesting barrier that a lot of carbon capture technologies suffer. And that's what actually our technology generates excitement from the public. Because so for direct air capture, currently the average industry energy consumption is at 7.5 gigajoules per ton of CO2. And that makes it really controversial because it's energy costly that directly translated into the prices. And we have done that in 1.3 gigajoules per ton of CO2 compared to the 7.5, which is the world's lowest energy cost that we've have in the carbon capture technology. So we can capture CO2 pulling from the air with so much lower energy consumption than all the other conventional carbon capture technologies are consuming. And especially when we're competing with the data centers and AI infrastructure, it's really important to have a low carbon intensity, low energy intensity carbon capture technologies. And even for our DAC, we're choosing locations where we can integrate the renewable energy costs. So even further down to 1.3 gigajoules and lowering the barrier of that energy intensity. So also with the better unit economics for our technology. So energy for us is a double-edged sword as well. Yeah, it's an opportunity, and at the same time, is what we need to really consider well.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you, panelists. I do want to open up the floor to our guests here. If you've got questions, I think we got one here.
Yeah, thanks. It was great discussion. Chris, the sort of climate policy vibe shift that we've had has been global in some ways, but the U.S. has also been a bit of an outlier. And I think all of you have mentioned during the course of the discussion a partner or customer from outside. So is that a conscious shift for you, and is that something that you would recommend to sort of other climate entrepreneurs? Is just start looking internationally, maybe much earlier in your journey than you might otherwise?
Yeah, I think definitely yes for us. So since carbon capture technology was built based on a policy-driven market, a lot of policies around the world, like EU ETS, was actually the compliance pressure that allowed us to get that early customers from heavy industries. Without it, they wouldn't be looking for customers before the regulations tighten further. So EU ETS globally, also Singapore, Japan, South Korea have a lot of mandates. So really not only relying on this US policy, it's really great to look into all the other geographies around the world because there are a lot of compliance market there too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say I'd reiterate that as well. A lot of, if you ask yourself what regions are the best for advancing climate in terms of policy, everyone, like the EU is probably the first thing that comes to everyone's mind. But as Andy mentioned, I think that there's a really great frontier in that market in East Asia with South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. There's a lot of policy that supports decarbonization in those countries. South Korea, for example, the CHPS and DEA are two different regulations in that country that support clean energy production. Singapore has their own. Japan has a contract for difference supporting hydrogen. So those policies do exist, and it's not just, if you want clean tech, think EU. It's the whole rest of the world exists outside of the United States as well.
So I'm going to take the opposite view, which is effectively, we are a US-based company. We're Build Buy America compliant. We can access all the federal funding, even though it's stalled more recently. And we're deploying physical infrastructure and building out a public charging network. So when you think about it, if you look at gas stations or railroads or anything from the past, that ultimately boots on the ground and building capacity in a certain jurisdiction is how you actually make these projects happen. And if you try to say you're going to expand to all these different places internationally and you're a startup with only so many resources and so much time, energy, and focus, you really can't progress certain projects internationally unless you have operations set up in other territories. So as much as it's a convenient concept for an investor to armchair quarterback and say, why don't you just do this in Europe? Well, the reality is the time it takes for us to go through the regulatory framework of Europe, develop the same types of relationships and partners, 2 years pass and we get to the midterms, and frankly, the pendulum potentially swings in the other direction. So there's an aspect of, yes, we've been approached by people across 6 of the 7 continents to deploy our chargers, and everybody thinks it's a great idea to bring this into Argentina or Southeast Asia or everywhere in between. But the reality is, unless they're coming with significant investment to build out a division of the company where we can license technology for them to effectively franchise in the country that they're talking about, you're just dealing with too much complexity to make it worth the time and energy beyond a few calls of exploratory. That's not to say at a later stage of our company, we wouldn't more seriously entertain those conversations. And we do have international investors from Australia to Europe to Canada and everywhere in between. But the reality is, like, maintaining focus and recognizing that if you build the railroad from New York to Boston, then you got that. You've built a business. If you try to basically build railroad tracks that just have a piece there and a piece there, then it becomes a fragmented ecosystem that you can't really effectively manage. So we're still focused on the US market, in spite of some of the headwind challenges. I mean, there's certainly opportunity in Canada as the second market that we can enter without so many challenges. But beyond that, at this point, we have to remain focused on the US.
Yeah, I agree with Josh. I think in our case, even having the first deployment in Canada was huge lift. Again, it's in the other side of it's on the West Coast, and providing service, it's tough. It's not just selling a material that goes there and whatever happens. Is that you have to resolve all the maintain and train the installers. You have to train them on how to maintain the unit. It's a heavy lift, and for us, the policies have never brought any financial incentive. So we only have to sell based on the financial value proposition, the economic value proposition. The policy brings awareness, which is different. Maybe gives us a preferential view, but certainly it's not doesn't motivate any customer to adopt. And so going to Europe or Asia, it's the same problem with the added complication of being overseas, and the same thing with the maintenance, training, installation, compliance. So Canada was a very important lesson that we learned very quickly. That it's easier to do work here.
Got time for, I'll go here and then I'll go to Sandra in the back.
Hi, thanks for your time. My name is Lily and I attend for DTE over the summer. My question is for Jeff. How are you thinking about site selection in terms of where to go first? Obviously Detroit is very auto heavy city, so I'm just curious what utilities, what areas of the country you're targeting, and the reasoning behind that.
Sure. Well, first, I mean, I'm not sure if you work at DTE when we won the emerging tech contract, but ultimately we have funding through DTE to deploy in Detroit, and with OMFE, another Michigan state level organization that's provided us funding to deploy across the state of Michigan. And there's a couple other projects on the go right now, but I'm really drawing that in that there's these concentric circles of basically building that trust, getting initial pilot projects to full-scale commercial deployment. And so at this point, I mean, Michigan's been a great early market for us. We go through a number of things to identify sites. First, there's just the basic question of pole ownership, because we're effectively doing pole attachment agreements where it's either owned by city agency, the utility, or some private entity if you're dealing with like REITs or some other aspect of the private sector. And so most people just obviously are looking around and see poles and they have lights on them, and it seems pretty natural in the fabric of the community. But in what we do, we're trying to understand that ownership structure, and often it's varied from one street to literally across the street, where it could be a utility or city-owned pole, and there may be different requirements in order to mount technology to those poles, or frankly just no frameworks that exist that we then work with like DTE to define the framework for utility pole attachment in the region. When you're looking about like what makes sense from an EV adoption and charger rollout perspective, typically we try to be data driven, being using geospatial tools to look at population, EV and gas car ownership, traffic patterns, ultimately where the other chargers are, equity factors, when that's still a consideration for agencies that hopefully still care about those things. And through that can triangulate where the chargers would be most meaningfully deployed in the built environment. Then beyond that, you go through the desktop study of like looking at pictures, maps, etc., to define like what could be feasible sites. And then ultimately, eventually, when you have budget attached to a project for X amount of chargers to be deployed within a certain region, like the state of Michigan, you end up having EPC firms, like contractors that are supporting the electrical work, who are usually utility certified on approved lists, that then will go out under us as a subcontractor to look at what's physically happening in the built environment. You often are learning things of how to actually do the interconnection from a value engineering perspective, like actually run the wires and do those drawings from an engineering submission that have to get stamped and approved and all of that through a process to ultimately turning on that charger. So there's a level of complexity in the project development cycle, but the reality is it's coming back to, it's not just having an innovative technology, but being able to take that as a turnkey solution to utilities like DTE or cities like Detroit or private sector partners like Michigan Central and New Lab, each one of them which we're working with in Michigan as an example, and each one of them having slightly different maps of how you get that charger turned on.
Awesome. Sandra, yeah.
Curious to hear from all of you, if you talk external investor money, and understanding that the market was shifted, policy changes, but things, swings and roundabouts, there's ups and downs, markets. But looking back on that experience, what are some things that you wish you'd known about the fundraising process that you tell new entrepreneurs at this point in time? If you didn't take external advice
And
outside of the CTV networks, things like that, any tips on?
and just so we have like about 1 minute left, so I just want to make sure we said level set here. So
Okay, I'll be very, very quick. We got VC money. Always nice to have VC money. If anybody has a check, talk to me. Money are never enough. The VCs are your ally, and they are there to make you successful. They are not there just to. They want to have a return, and they do really care about you. So they want you to succeed. So they can provide a lot of hard pushes, and it's an incredible experience. Fundraising, it's very painful. I mean, you talk to a couple of hundred VCs, and maybe you get 2, 3, 5 of them. So say if you are used to sell something, the percentage is much higher. So psychologically, it's devastating. And one of the biggest advice that I could offer is that if you want to fundraise, just fundraise. One of the mistakes that I made is that last year while fundraising, I was trying to patch holes with the team, trying to help them also on the day-to-day basis. That extends the fundraising process, which is not healthy for a startup. If you want to fundraise, just do that.
For me, I'll do quick as well. Fundraising 2 years ago and now is really different. And what I learned is that how different it could be in different years. So focus on de-risking and how you can still survive without this external funding, and having those risk profile really helps persuade the investors outside. So yeah, de-risking, yeah, always backup plans also. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, guys. In interest of time, I think we're gonna have to call it to wrap it up here. Thank you to the panelists for your informative insights. Thank you for all of you for your questions, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
Round of
you.
applause.